There's a photograph I keep on my phone. Not because it's beautiful, because it's the last image of a man who didn't yet know he was about to disappear. He's standing at the top of the palace steps and he's smiling. That kind of smile that costs something. The one you practice in mirrors until your face forgets it's performing. I was there that morning. I saw what came next.
The fog came in off the Thames before 6. That particular London fog that doesn't roll, it settles, like it owns the pavements, like it paid rent, and is simply returning home.
I'd been standing outside the gates of St. James's Palace since 5:47 because I had a shoot to set up, a client who wanted atmospheric royal backdrops, and a tripod with a loose leg that I'd been meaning to fix since April. It was mid-October, the kind that makes tourists wrap their scarves twice and still shiver while the pigeons carry on like it's nothing because it is nothing to them. The morning staff were arriving, catering vans, a woman with a clipboard moving like she was late for something important and always had been, 2 officers in the kind of suits that don't crease, which is how you know they're not decorative. I was fiddling with my lens cap when I first noticed him, not because he was doing something unusual. He was doing nothing unusual. That's what caught me. He was just standing there beside the gate post, not on duty, you could tell because his posture was slightly wrong for ceremony. Slightly too human for the role, staring out across the road at absolutely nothing, and doing it with the kind of intensity that made you look too, just to see what you'd missed. His name, I'd find out later, was Edward. Not Eddie, not Ed. Edward, the full syllables. His mother's insistence, apparently, one of those small family obsessions that get carried like heirlooms, pointless but preserved. He was 29 years old. He was, by every documented measure of the institution he served, exemplary. I'd been shooting royal events for 11 years by then. You develop an eye for the ones who are in it versus the ones who are performing being in it. Most of the men I'd photographed over those years had long since dissolved into the role. You could point a camera at them, and what you'd capture wasn't a face, it was a function. A uniform filling space with practiced dignity. Edward wasn't like that yet. Or maybe, and this is the thing I kept returning to later, he'd been like that once, and whatever had happened in the weeks before that October morning had undissolved him, had given him his edges back. He was in civilian clothes, dark coat collar up. The kind of careful and anonymous dressing that people do when they're well known but don't want to be recognized, which of course is its own kind of recognizable. He saw me looking. I did what I always do, looked back at my camera, made some unnecessary adjustment, pretended I'd been composing a shot of the ironwork. When I looked up again, he was still watching me, but not with suspicion. With something more exhausting. Recognition. Not of me specifically, of the apparatus, the lens, the documentation of his existence by a stranger for reasons that had nothing to do with him. He looked away first. I don't know why I followed him. That's a lie. I know exactly why. 11 years of this work and you develop a gut for when something is about to happen, the way fishermen read water. Something in his stillness had the quality of a held breath, the pause before. He walked north toward the park. Not quickly. Not the walk of someone late or afraid or running, the walk of someone who has made a decision and is now simply executing it at their own pace, for the first time in a long time, at their own pace. I kept my distance, dropped my tripod against a railing and hoped for the best, which is not best practice for a 400-pound piece of equipment, but here we are. The park was nearly empty that early, a jogger. 2 dog walkers engaged in that thing dog walkers do, where the dogs make friends and the humans are forced to also make friends and stand there in the cold, doing the social math of whether they have to keep stopping every morning forever now. Edward walked past them without registering. He found a bench, not the closest one, not the most sheltered one, the one in the middle of nothing with the widest view of the pale sky, and he sat down. He put his elbows on his knees. He stared at his hands. I sat on the grass about 30 meters back. Behind a tree, I was kidding myself, was adequate cover. And I watched him, his hands. That's what I kept photographing, not his face. The hands. They were moving, not fidgeting, discovering he turned them over. Looked at the palms, then the backs, then flexed his fingers one at a time like he was testing whether they belonged to him. I've photographed athletes after defeat and actors after premieres and politicians after scandal. I have a whole taxonomy of how people occupy their bodies when their identity is in crisis.
This wasn't that. This was something quieter and stranger. This was a man who looked like he couldn't quite remember what he was for. He'd grown up in it, I'd later learn. Not royalty, not by blood, not by title, but service to it, which in some ways is its own hereditary condition. His grandfather had been a palace steward for 40 years. His father, a senior officer in the household division, for 31. His mother had taken a secretarial role in the Lord Chamberlain's office until her knees gave out. The palace wasn't Edward's workplace, it was his ecosystem. The water he'd always swum in, so thoroughly that the concept of air had never quite occurred to him. He'd been enrolled in the right schools, the ones that prepared you for this kind of life, not academically, but atmospherically. You learned to carry yourself, to speak when spoken to and to speak very well when speaking was required. You learned that excellence was the baseline, and that anything below it was a species of failure that had no name because it was too ordinary to require one. He'd been accepted into the household cavalry at 22. By 25, he had a reputation for the kind of reliability that institutions cherish and individuals sometimes drown in. He'd never been late, he'd never been visibly rattled. He'd never, in 7 years of service, been observed to do what he was doing right now. Sit on a park bench in the early morning fog with his coat pulled tight and his eyes somewhere far from the ground they were pointed at. A child appeared, out of nowhere the way children do, like they materialize from pockets of dimension adults can't access. She was maybe 5 or 6, in yellow rain boots that were aggressively yellow, the yellow of things that want to be seen. She had broken free of whoever was responsible for her, and was now conducting an investigation of the puddles with the rigorous focus of someone who considers this important work. She reached Edward's bench, stopped, looked at him with that unfiltered children's assessment, the one that skips social courtesy and goes straight for the data. "Why are you sad?" she said. "Not are you sad, why are you sad?" The inevitability of it was just understood. Edward looked at her. The first time I'd seen him look at anything directly in 20 minutes. "I'm not sure," he said. She considered this, pulled at a loose thread on her boot. "My nan says, when you don't know why you're sad, it means something's changing. Your nan sounds smart. She makes terrible tea though," the girl said, with the gravity of someone establishing important caveats about their sources. And Edward, for the first time that morning, laughed, not the performance kind, not the kind that costs something. Just the involuntary, helpless, caught off guard kind that escapes before the face can arrange itself. The girl seemed satisfied with this result and went back to her puddles. Edward watched her go. Then he looked up at the sky. It was still pale, still that washed London grey-white that isn't quite morning and isn't quite anything yet. He breathed, just breathed, like it was something he'd been neglecting. The decision had been building for 8 months. I'd come to understand. 8 months since the night he'd sat in his small, immaculate flat in Kensington. The one the role provided, the one that smelled like polish and propriety and contained almost nothing of him. No photographs except one of his mother. No books except the ones related to protocol. No evidence of a person separate from a function. And asked himself a question he'd never been able to fully form before. Is this mine, or did I just inherit it? And then the worst question that followed it. What would be mine if I chose? He'd sat with those questions through winter, carried them through the ceremonial routines, through the inspections and the drills and the events where he stood at precise angles and monitored rooms and kept everything safe and felt. Under all of it, some small thing that kept trying to make a sound he wouldn't let it make. By February, he'd started writing not reports, not correspondence, a journal. The first one he'd kept since he was 14, and his English teacher had assigned it, and he'd dutifully maintained it for exactly the required 10 weeks, and not one day beyond. The journal from this year was different. Ragged, honest in the way things are honest, only when you don't think anyone will read them. He wrote about the mornings he stood at his post and felt the enormous institutional weight of everything around him and thought, I am a figure in someone else's painting. I'm so good at being a figure in someone else's painting. He wrote about his father carefully,
the way you handle things that might be explosive, and the conversation they'd had when Edward was 17 and had mentioned, once briefly, that he'd been reading philosophy and found it interesting, might want to study it. His father hadn't been unkind. That was the complicated part. He'd been perfectly warm and perfectly clear, and he'd said, "That's good, son. Good to have interests." And then he'd moved on, the way rivers move around rocks. And that had been the end of philosophy. It hadn't felt like a wound at 17. It felt like weather. It only felt like a wound at 29, when Edward sat in his adequate flat and realized he'd never, since that conversation, seriously entertained the idea that he was allowed to want something that didn't fit the outline he'd been handed. He stood up from the bench. I nearly dropped my camera. He stood, buttoned his coat, looked once more at the pale sky. Then he reached into his inner pocket and took out an envelope, not dramatic, not ceremonial. The same way you might take out a shopping list. He turned it over in his hands once, looked at it, then set it on the bench beside him. He looked at it for a long moment, then he started walking, away from the palace, away from the gates, in the opposite direction entirely. I don't know what was in the envelope. I could speculate. An experienced person in his world could probably narrow it down to 2 or 3 possibilities, and one of them would be right. But I don't think it matters, actually. What it contained were words he'd finally managed to put in the right order. Words that were probably precise and probably cost him more than anything he'd bought with money. Words that said, in whatever form they took, "I need to find out if there's a me that belongs to myself." The envelope sat on the bench in the October fog. The child in yellow boots found it 20 minutes later, brought it to her grandmother, who brought it to a park warden, who brought it following the address on the front to the right hands. By then, Edward was already on the tube, sitting in a plastic seat between 2 strangers, listening to the rattle and hum of a city that didn't know his name. For the first time in as long as he could measure it, no one in his immediate vicinity knew who he was or what he was for. He sat with that. Let it be strange. Let it be underneath the strange, something that felt almost like the beginning of air. That was the morning Edward walked away from the crown. Not the crown he wore, the one that had been fitted, quietly, lovingly, over years, by people who meant him well and had sat on his head so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. He was 29 years old. He had no idea who he was. That, it turned out, was the first honest thing he'd known in years. The first week without the structure almost broke him, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone watching would have clocked as breaking. He didn't weep into soup or stare blankly at walls for hours. It was quieter than that and more insidious. The way the withdrawal hit him in the mornings when there was no itinerary and he'd wake at 5:30 from 29 years of muscle memory and sit on the edge of whatever bed he was in and feel the weight of all that unscheduled air pressing in. He'd taken a room in Edinburgh. Small city flat belonging to a university colleague of his cousin's, who'd been glad enough to let it at short notice and who had the particular gift of providing a key without also providing conversation. The flat was on the 3rd floor of a tenement on a steep grey street, and it smelled like old radiators and someone's previous cooking experiments, and it was the most uninstitutional space he'd occupied since childhood. He hated it. He loved it in the way you love something that is doing something to you that needs to be done. His mobile had been deliberately not announced. He'd transferred his number to a new handset, left the old one with the saved contacts that read like a blueprint of his former life in a drawer in his Kensington flat. He'd told his supervisor in writing, given reasonable notice, handled the bureaucratic end with the same competency that had defined 7 years of service. His father had called 3 times on the old number before realizing. His mother had texted once. It said, "I have your Nan's scarf if you ever want it. Take care of yourself, love." He read that one for a long time. Edinburgh in October is not the Edinburgh of tourism photography. It's something rawer. The castle doesn't glow romantically. It just sits there on its ancient black rock, doing what old stone things do in cold rain, which is endure without comment. The tourists still come, fewer of them braver or more stubborn, in jackets that are clearly insufficient. Edward walked, That was mostly what he did that first week, walked the city like he was trying to understand its grammar, down the Royal Mile and up again, through the grass market and into the Cowgate and out the other side into neighborhoods that didn't try to be picturesque. He walked until the city stopped feeling like a backdrop and started feeling like a place. He bought bread from a bakery run by an elderly Polish woman who gave it to him before he'd finished paying and didn't wait for thanks. He sat in a pub that opened at 11 and ordered coffee because it was too early for anything else, and the barman brought it without remark and left him alone for 45 minutes. He read. That was the other thing. He'd brought 5 books in a bag from a second-hand shop near Victoria Station. Chosen somewhat at random from shelves, he drifted past without a list or a purpose for the first time in his adult life. A philosophy text, the first one since he was 17, and it sat in his hands like a thing retrieved from somewhere lost. A novel about a fisherman, a short history of maps. A collection of essays by a Scottish poet whose name he'd recognized from school and whose thinking turned out to be sharper than he'd expected at 15. He read slowly. He'd never read slowly. There had never been time, or there had always been the sense that there wasn't, which amounts to the same thing. Now he read a paragraph and sat with it before moving to the next one, the way you're supposed to eat when you've been told to chew properly, and have never managed it until now. On the 5th day, his hands stopped doing that thing. He only noticed because he was making tea and reached for the kettle and realized they were just hands. Doing a task, not turning themselves over looking for something they'd lost. He stood in the kitchen of the rented flat with the kettle in one hand and the mug in the other, and the October rain doing what it does against the window, and thought, oh, just that. Oh, there was a library 2 streets over. Municipal, underfunded in the way that libraries always seem to be, with a drop ceiling and fluorescent lights that gave everything a slightly medical quality. He started going there in the afternoons, not for any particular resource. He'd sit at one of the long tables near the reference section and read, or sometimes not read, just sit in the presence of organized knowledge and the particular quality of silence that libraries generate, which is not the silence of absence, but the silence of many people being quietly inside their own heads simultaneously. On the 3rd visit, a girl sat across from him. She was studying, from the look of it, textbooks stacked with the specific architecture of someone who has a system, highlighters in 3 colors, a notebook open to a page of notes that from across the table looked like a different language and probably was. She didn't look up for an hour. When she did, it was only because she'd knocked her pen off the table and it had rolled to his side, and he'd picked it up and offered it back. Thanks, she said. Then, because she was apparently someone who noticed things, you've been here 3 days. You've been here 3 days too. I'm doing my PhD, she said. Explanation offered, entitlement to space established. Then, what about you? He thought about the various accurate answers to this. I'm not sure yet, he said. She looked at him for a moment with the assessing look of someone who has spent years training herself to determine whether a statement is interesting or evasive. That's either very honest or a line, she said. It's honest. She went back to her notes. Rosaline, she said without looking up. Edward. Okay, Edward. A pen uncapped, a highlighter applied. Don't distract me. He hadn't been planning to, but he found himself sitting there for another hour when he'd meant to leave, and when he did leave, he was aware that the library felt different from the outside than it had the first 2 days. Warmer, somehow, he didn't examine that. He went home and made terrible tea and read 30 pages of the philosophy text and slept better than he had in 8 months. The second week, the calls from home became a low-frequency hum he'd learned to hear without letting it vibrate through him. His father, through his cousin now, having worked out that the old number was dead, had sent a message that was careful and complicated and said several things and meant several others. The way his father always communicated in a language of implication that Edward had spent 29 years learning to decode. What it decoded to roughly was, I don't understand this, I'm worried about you. I don't know how to say that. I wish you'd come back. What it said was closer to, the family is concerned. There are procedures for this kind of thing. Please make contact when you're ready. Edward sat with the translation of it, with the fact that his father's love and his father's vocabulary were 2 things that had never fully learned to find each other. and that this was not his father's fault precisely, and also not entirely not his fault, and that these complicated accountings were going to take longer than 2 weeks to complete. He replied simply, "I'm well. I'll call when I'm ready. Thank you for checking."
He almost added, "I love you." He almost didn't. He sent it with the 3 words, because the thing that was happening to him in this rented flat in this rain-soaked city seemed to be partly about deciding to say things he meant even when they sat awkwardly in the air. Rosaleen was studying the history of land reform in the Scottish Highlands. He learned this on day 4 of her, not because she volunteered it, but because he asked what the books were, and she told him with the particular intensity of someone who finds their subject genuinely, not performatively, important. She had theories, positions. She used words with precision, not the precision of performance, but the precision of someone who'd argued these points often enough to know which words did the actual work and which ones were furniture. He asked questions, real ones, not the courtesy questions he'd been asking most of his life, the ones designed to seem interested while leaving the asker untouched. Questions that came from the thing the philosophy book and the 4 days of walking and the bad sleep and the good sleep had shaken loose, a genuine desire to understand how other people made sense of the world. She was surprised, he could tell. She'd expected less from someone she'd pegged initially as either lost or on some kind of gap year self-discovery holiday, both of which she'd made clear she had limited patience for. He wasn't those things, he wasn't sure yet what he was, but the question, genuinely interesting, genuinely asked, she answered, at length, with a specificity that required him to pay attention, and paying attention felt good in a way he hadn't expected, in a way that made him realize how much of his previous life he'd spent being present, physically, procedurally, while actually attending to almost nothing. "You're actually listening," she said at one point, as if checking. "I'm trying to most people listen at a person. You're listening to the thing I'm saying." He didn't know what to do with that. He stored it. The 3rd week he started writing again. The journal, or what had evolved from it, he'd been making notes since the first day in Edinburgh. Rough ones, more like inventory than prose. Words that were trying to become something. He'd write a sentence and look at it, and cross out the parts that sounded like the person he'd been trained to present, and write toward the parts that felt like something raw and less managed. It was slow, it was often wrong. He wrote several pages one evening, and read them back the next morning and deleted the whole thing, because it read like a dispatch from someone who was performing self-discovery rather than having it. He started again. "I'm 29 years old, and I don't know what I like to eat for breakfast when no one else's preferences are involved." That was the first line he kept. He thought about that for a while. It was a very small thing. It was also not a small thing at all. He'd realized it that morning when he stood in the kitchen of the rented flat, his kitchen, temporarily a kitchen over which no protocol presided, and he'd had eggs and bread and tinned tomatoes and a leftover piece of cheese, and he'd stood there actually deciding, with no frame of reference for what was correct, what he wanted. He'd made an omelette, added the tomatoes, ate standing at the counter looking at the rain because he'd chosen to, not because there was no chair. It had tasted like something. He wrote 600 words that morning, kept all of them. They weren't particularly good. They were completely his. The evening he walked up to Calton Hill was the evening he understood what had been happening.